everybody. Well, she's no Sadie Marquardt, but Sadie Marquardt doesn't belly dance with swords. And since today I want to talk about a slice of Arabian history, hers was the obvious choice. Specifically, we're going to take a very close look at an ancient Yemeni tribe called the Subehi, information about which was contained in a very thin slice of a letter written nearly 80 years ago. The letter, written in 1940 by Sir Stewart Perowne, describes the background to and a course of action taken by the British to stop this tribe of 20,000 marauders who for 100 years, up until Perowne put the brakes on their actions, had been raiding, looting, pillaging, plundering, and committing murder. So, whether you are a looter, someone who sympathizes with looters, someone who detests them, or someone simply intrigued by history, you'll want to continue. But before continuing, I want to mention that the fact that this video focuses on a tribe is purely coincidental to the fact that my last video dealt with tribal behavior. That said, Stewart thought and reacted very much like René Girard, the focus of the previous video. Both happened to hold degrees in anthropology, and both were prolific authors. Girard wrote 20 and Stewart 18 books. Most importantly for our purposes, both developed theories that held water and that are therefore worth considering. These types of people, individuals we generally regard as deep thinkers, are the types who observe patterns of behavior, patterns in nature, or patterns in history. They collect and store this information and then invariably connect it to various relevant points no differently than we mere plebeians take note that our cat prefers a treat of tuna fish to scrod, that the bougainvillea shrub loves the sun, or that we ought to put down a footpath on a curve, as we note people tend to angle off rather than walk along sharp corners. In short, we all make observations over time, act on them, and generally enjoy seeing the results that benefit the general good. After all, most of us want to keep our pets, plants, and fellow pedestrians happy. If we neglect to take such actions either because we're lazy, don't care, or can't stand seeing happy pets, plants, or people, in fact, would prefer to see them all miserable, well, we're likely psychopaths. Which brings me back to the Subehi. When Perowne wrote the letter to his commanding officer, he had been serving in Yemen as a lieutenant in the British Army with the designation of Strategic Information Officer, the modern-day equivalent of intelligence officer. Information he provided HQ regarding regional tribes was compiled along with that of hundreds of other British officers who were stationed in British protectorates throughout the Middle East into a meticulously organized encyclopedia called the Gazetteer of Arabian Tribes. It was an encyclopedia that I happened to come across one day while poking around in a Dubai library, as one does, when, while passing rows of shelves, the gold glint from this title printed in Arabic-style script against the forest green binding of the volumes caught my eye. I gently withdrew volume S, fully intent on looking up some dirt on some Emiratis I knew who had surnames that began with the letter S. To tell you the truth, as I carried the heavy volume to a desk and lifted its cover to peek inside, I felt a bit nervous, like I was about to read someone's diary. But there it was, in a public library, so... As it turned out, once I began leafing through it, I changed my mind about the Emiratis when I suddenly chanced upon Perowne's elegant and engaging letter. In that letter he delineated actions of the Subehi and repercussions that followed. The Subehi were awful. And oh, don't worry, I am going to read his letter to you. And remember, most importantly, later on I'll address my feelings about Perowne's solution to ending the myriad problems the Subehi caused, how his solution, for a while anyway, served the general good and made people happy. And we'll discuss all this just because I found his letter, forthrightly photocopied it, saved it for years, and am now sharing it with you. But first, a bit of background on Yemen in the 1940s.
At the southern end of the Red Sea is the British seaport of Aden, and among the many places of interest is the crater market, so called because the town itself is said to have been built in the crater of an extinct volcano. The native knife grinder is having a busy morning. Transport is by camel or camel cart, a crude three-sided box on wheels that makes the tall beast look even taller. And when they do things in a big way, they run to a camel caravan. The Aden Camel Corps is a fine body of picked men, fearless and well-disciplined soldiers. But they say the sergeant major's just like all the other sergeant majors, if you know what they mean. These men handle their mounts with all the ease of a dashing Bombay lancer. In fact, they form a valuable outpost of the Bombay Corps, quartered over 1,500 miles distant across the Arabian Sea. The fine fighting spirit of these dusky sons of Aden is in keeping with the port's role of watchdog of Britain.
Sir, I have the honor to forward to you hereunder a few observations and reflections which suggested themselves to me after my recent visits to Abyan and the Subehi country. My first acquaintance with these two districts was in the summer of 1937. It seemed strange then that two areas, neither of which lies more than a few hours' drive from Aden, should be given over to anarchy and violence, for not only do the main approaches to Aden from the east and the west pass through them, but they are both regions of great potential fertility. It was only on examination of the past history of each territory that showed how deep-rooted were the insecurity and chaos which possessed them. The Subehis, as the archives recorded, had given trouble since 1841. The following details about 100 years of Subehi troublemaking were gleaned from Wikipedia. From the mid-1800s, the designation of state when referring to the Subehi is contentious. They were divided into a number of petty clans who owed no allegiance to a single paramount chief, had little to no political unity, and entered treaty relations with the British separately from other clans within this tribe. In 1871, the Mansuri clan of the Subehis attacked and plundered a caravan coming into Aden. A police detachment was dispatched against them, and one of the chiefs and most of his party were killed. In 1871, the Subehi chiefs came into Aden and tendered their submission. They also entered into engagements to preserve the peace of the roads, to restore plundered property, and to abolish transit duties and taxes on the roads passing through their territories in return for monthly stipends. In April 1899, owing to continual robberies by the Subehi, the Abdali Sultan was given permission to occupy their area. In November 1899, the Atifi clan of the Subehi attacked an Abdali post, but when the Abdali gathered a large force against them, the Atifi submitted. In 1900, Muhammad Salih Tatar took refuge among them and incited them to plunder. In 1902, several skirmishes took place in Subehi country. The Subehi continued to plunder during 1904. In March 1904, British Captain Warneford was murdered as he approached the Subehi boundary. In 1906, a postal worker carrying government mail was shot by the Subehis. The greater part of the mail was recovered, but the tribesmen, failing to surrender the offenders as they were called upon to do, were prohibited from entering Aden, and payment of their stipend was suspended. Ultimately, the murderer of Captain Warneford was shot by one of the regional sheikhs. In July 1906, a dhow flying the Italian flag was wrecked and pillaged by the Subehi off the Barhimi coast. The Barhimi sheikh was ordered to pay compensation, but having failed to do so, the amount was paid by the government to Italy and subsequently deducted from his stipend. In 1915, some of the Subehi clans took part in looting. In February 1919, an agreement was concluded with the Abdali Sultan, placing the Subehi again under his general control. In September 1927, a large force of North Yemeni troops invaded Subehi territory. In December 1928, when a curtailment of doles to the Subehi chiefs was effected, the tribesmen became restive and resorted to their old tactics of murder and pillage. They were ordered to cease and to make restitution for their offenses, but because they refused to do so, air action was taken against the more guilty. The tribesmen eventually made their submission. In 1931, gross revenue of the tribe was estimated at 8,000 rials a year. the then equivalent of $600. The population of the Subehi tribe is 20,000. Continuing. Their habitations are widely scattered in remote mountain valleys to which it is easy for them to deny access. Most of them lack any tribal organization and resemble the locusts which moved King Solomon to wonder. They have no king, yet they go forth all by their bands, and, like locusts, they destroyed. In Abiyan, the issues of the trouble were different, but the insecurity was the same. Two sultans, each jealous of the other, neither mentally sound, maintained their ancestral blood feud with obstinate fanaticism. Their tribesmen suffered, their fields lay uncultivated, and time and strength, which should have been employed in supporting life, were devoted to its destruction. In neither area was it safe to travel. Exaction was the rule. Murder was by no means rare. With agriculture and commerce at a standstill, it was little wonder that the inhabitants fell victim to hunger, disease, and apathy, from which they were only aroused by the commission of some crime against them, or the opportunity to commit crimes against their neighbors. Among the many recollections of that period which will always remain with me, I may perhaps be allowed to recall two. The first concerns the Subehi country. On a stifling afternoon in July 1937, a little more than a month after my arrival in Aden, I was motoring in a rickety taxi to the Sha'ab Valley. The road was a dune-strewn wreck, and the car, quite unfitted for such a journey, sank again and again in the sands. A dust-laden wind added to our discomfort. At last we reached Riga. The inhabitants crowded around the car, demanding cigarettes and money. When these were refused, they became abusive, and it was with difficulty that we obtained water and went on our way. Further on, we found the track blocked with stones and wood. When we stopped to remove the obstruction, children rushed out to levy blackmail, and failing to obtain it, they threw stones, urged on by their elders, who skulked under the palm trees which fringed the valley. Finally, the car stuck deep in the wadi bed. My driver called upon a man lying beneath a tree to come and help us. He refused. "But this is a representative of the government," my driver said. "We recognize no government here," said the skulker. I said that I should come back. It was all I could say. And back I went, 6 weeks later, with a detachment of the Sultan of Lahej's army and a squadron of aircraft in support. The other memory is of my first view of Derjaj in November 1937. These people had been in opposition to their nominal sultan for many years, and had therefore incurred the displeasure of the government, who had from time to time attempted to discipline them. No member of the political staff had been suffered to enter the village for many years, so it would be interesting to learn firsthand of conditions there. We were formally received, and on the morrow their sultan himself was able to join us. But never have I found myself in a sadder and more suspicious atmosphere. The villagers were divided into two rival parties which hated each other fiercely. The only emotions which from time to time united them were loathing of their sultan, who oppressed them with sadistic spite, and distrust of the protecting government power, who allowed them to be so maltreated. The men were famished and feckless, their children emaciated. No one seemed to have any initiative. Their homes were falling into ruin, and worst of all, their once fertile fields, on which their very life must depend, were a dusty desert, owing to the diversion of the water channel which irrigated them by the neighboring tribe, with which they carried on a guerrilla war almost within sight of the village. They were a people without hope in a land that was desolate. Within the last few days I have revisited both Derjaj and the Subehi country, in neither of which had I been for more than 20 months. From the same rooftop from which I had previously surveyed the surrounding desolation on my first visit and looked out over the village, I saw that every house seemed to have been rebuilt. The strong, simple lines of the dars, with their graceful sloped batters, stood out bravely against a background not of dust, but of cultivation. The corn is green once more, and the sesame grows again. The Akil wise man pointed out his own fields with pride and gratitude. Gratitude is not a common sentiment, so all the more touching when it is encountered. And these poor folk are grateful for what has been done for them. They ask only that the protecting hand may not be removed. As we neared Dirjaj last Saturday, we passed through a belt of cultivation. On the outskirts of the village, we were surrounded by a swarm of merry, well-fed children, every one of whom was determined to shake hands with each several occupant of the car. The villagers, headed by their Akils, then approached with banners. A hollow square was formed, an ox was ceremonially slaughtered, and antiphons of welcome were chanted as the tribesmen moved slowly round the square, while at intervals shots were fired in salute. It so happens that I have seen these people in many vicissitudes, as rebels, as fugitives, their village forsaken and in flames, as returning exiles, excluded by the rifles of that same mad sultan who had insisted on their return, and as a broken remnant on the ashes of their looted homes, raising, as if in defiance of fate, their melancholy tribal chant, a prelude to a new hope. But last Saturday I saw them happy, vigorous, and grateful. Where before was fear, there was now confidence. Where drought, water. Where famine, abundance. And where danger, peaceful commerce. What had brought this change? The same question presented itself in the Subehi country, which I visited the next day. No longer do the people surround your car to beg. They come about you to exchange greetings and jokes, to be told that they are rogues and to admit it, to assure you that they no longer shoot their neighbors, nor their neighbors them, and to ask you for the honor of the government to send them a new bladder for their football. The road is clear, the fields are tilled, and the water courses, disputes about which are believed to have caused, within living memory, no fewer than 70 deaths. Yes, water is now distributed according to rules. The channel has been cleaned and deepened, and the area of cultivation enlarged. No longer do the inhabitants hide among their palm trees, but come forward to greet you and to thank that government which but 3 years ago they did not recognize for giving them peace. A little school which was started 2 years ago in a rude hut is now housed in a stone building. It has 60 pupils and 2 masters. The worst and vilest of the Subehi blood feuds, which had devastated 2 tribes for several generations and had culminated a few years ago in a savage assassination, seems to be well on the way to honorable settlement. In a country where formerly Macbeth's bitter cry, "It will have blood, they say blood will have blood," seemed the epitome of local philosophy, the arts of peace are at long last cultivated, and the blessings of security appreciated. Abiyan and the Subehi country together cover an area of over 2,000 square miles. They are among the most fertile districts in the whole protectorate. In such territory, to be sure, the Mission Civilisatrice, civilizing policy, has but just begun. But to have brought security to so wide a country, and to have infused hope into the breasts of its inhabitants in less than 3 years, surely justifies the policy which produced such results. How has this been done? The sequence has been, first, political contact, second, air action, and third, reconstruction. Contact has been established by political officers of your staff who have made friends with those members of the tribes who were ready to reciprocate their friendship. Their efforts were obstructed by a small but powerful group to whom any alteration of the status quo would mean a loss of profit and prestige. How was this opposition to be overcome? Virgil, however much as we may regret it, was right. If you spare those who have submitted, you must be prepared to continue to control the proud. In the short year during which I served as a political officer in the Protectorate, I visited the scene of 2 air actions shortly after their occurrence, and was a witness to 4 others. I hated them all, but Against my will, I was forced to admit that their effect was beneficial. The aerial strafing achieved their object of breaking the resistance of those opposed to the general welfare. They did so with hardly any casualties on either side, and amazingly left no rancor in the hearts of those against whom they were directed. It has been argued that air action is brutal and oppressive, but, much as I should like to agree, I cannot, from my experience, agree. I have seen the Haidara Mansour, within a few weeks of their village being bombed, greeting with cordiality and pride the very men who had bombed them. The folk of Wadi Ma'adin, when once the bombs had fallen, rallied as one man to government. And I learned last week that our most loyal supporter in the valley is a man whose house had been destroyed by aircraft. After the first Mansouri operation, on the morrow of their destruction of their principal fort, their sheikh was my guest, and that afternoon I rode unescorted with him through the mountains to his own village, where I was hospitably received. I could say the same of the Hamumi, the Sha'ari, and the Kutabi operations. I only recall these incidents because, being by nature and conviction pacific, I am nevertheless bound in honesty to declare what I have seen and known. Air action, however, is not by itself enough. It must not only be preceded by political action, which will limit it to the smallest possible compass, but it should clear the way for further political action. A bomb is a weapon of destruction. Construction must come from other sources. If the object of government is to hold a frontier or to repel invaders, air action is in itself sufficient, but it cannot by its very nature discharge any of the normal functions of administration. Once the punitive stage is passed and the constructive stage begins, ground forces become necessary. What of the future? If progress is to be maintained, it can only be by cooperation between the Royal Air Force, your political staff, and their police force. Even so, we must not go too fast or too far. You cannot, among these primitive people, employ westernizing methods. Our tribesmen are far less pliable, and they show their dislike of progress in the only manner known to them. The quick trick, the showy success, always despicable, are dangerous here. Change cannot be imposed from without. It must spring from within. It must be organic, and a generation may be needful for its development. Moreover, we must look ahead. If we attempt any kind of westernization or direct administration in this protectorate, we are laying up trouble for our successors. A generation will arise which has not known the old evil days, and we shall be confronted by the situation which has arisen sooner or later in more than one of the countries which we govern. It is well described in the words of Sir Herbert Edwards, "We are not liked anywhere. We were popular so long as we were plastering wounds, but the patient is well now, and he finds the doctor a bore. At present we are still plastering wounds, and there are plenty more to plaster. Our best medicine is security. Let us give security its plenty and allow the patient to develop in his own way. He will then be less likely to find the doctor a bore, and more inclined to feel rather kindly to those who, when he was ailing, restored him to health by methods which, though perhaps sometimes drastic, were eventually efficacious." Ladies and gentlemen, while in Yemen, Army Lieutenant Sir Stewart Perowne, who in his letter described himself as by nature pacific, both initiated and then witnessed the aftermath of bombings of tribal marauders, and afterward declared that although he found the situations unfortunate, could not but conclude that political action, and especially air power and reconstruction, ultimately served the general good. Merely days after these bombings, vicious marauders, thieves, looters, and murderers, and their folk were grateful and happy. Their reaction isn't surprising. In fact, most of us who've got a basic knowledge of history would find it at least reminiscent of the most brutal bombings on Earth, which took place in Japan. Days afterward, throngs of Japanese greeted American occupying soldiers bearing the same grateful, happy spirit for having put a welcome, abrupt end to the miserable war in the Pacific. At last, but alas, only for a while anyway, could the Yemeni people catch a breather and begin to thrive and flourish in an atmosphere of positive collaboration and progress. The blessings of the fruits of cooperation for mutual benefit rather than for devastation brought the hard work required to dig wells and administer irrigation essential for agriculture that results in well-fed livestock and then well-fed children whose bodies and minds can properly develop and whose parents have minds free of overbearing fear to think and create, build and maintain. According to Perowne, aerial strafing was the only way to solve the insidious 100-year-old antisocial scourge brought about by feckless thieves who, though were surrounded by fertile lands that had plenty of groundwater, chose to fight rather than farm, created nothing either for their present, much less future generations, and let their progeny suffer and starve. But clearly, ladies and gentlemen, there remains a very serious, insidious problem indeed. Since the British bade farewell to their protectorate in 1963, the same Yemen that had been exporting food, even before the recent war, began importing 95% of it. Imagine being the Arab world's poorest country and dedicating 95% of crops to Khat. Even coffee manufacturers in Yemen have to pay farmers to grow coffee beans instead of Khat, when the manufacturing of coffee can decently employ many. The very bitter leaves of this plant are typically stuffed into gaping maws and chewed for typically 4 hours a day, keeping masses of otherwise possibly productive men utterly unproductive and spitting in a land where tuberculosis is a problem, simply because doing so has become part of the culture and they claim to enjoy its narcotic effect, which oddly enough they tend to say helps them stay focused and work. A blatant untruth. Meanwhile, where infants and children had started to become plump, bright-eyed, and playful as children should be, they starve, as they must never. While it certainly doesn't help this situation that Saudi Arabia has bombed Yemen's ports, making access to imported food extremely difficult, the war itself cannot be blamed as the founding reason for Yemen's recrudescence. Perhaps the biggest part of the reason can be found in Perowne's own conclusion. After all, remember, in his letter, he told his commanding officer that now it was best the people be left to their own devices. As he said, the patient was healed, and the doctor was a bore. And I said his theory holds water. Well, ladies and gentlemen, do you think that 80 years ago Stewart Perowne could have imagined that the collective Yemeni patient of which he spoke, if left untethered and given what I'm sure he thought was the dignity and integrity of managing itself, would have ever led to this level of unspeakable horror? No collaboration, no agricultural plan, wasting precious groundwater on a plant that provides no nutrients and gives them the shame of starving babies? At the age of 39, Perowne was certainly optimistic and certainly unaware of how little sense of human connection and morality exists out in the real world, especially in a culture continuously placing vicious savagery against its fellow man as its highest ideal. Certainly Perowne was lacking in experience with tribal behavior. He could have taken some advice from Gerard. But Perowne knew Virgil, and all he needed to have done was heed the very words he shared with his commanding officer in that letter, words that I shall paraphrase. Spare those already conquered, but continue waging war until the haughty are brought low. Ladies and gentlemen, when Perowne left Yemen in 1940, he left behind many who had no intention of relinquishing their tribal propensity toward collectively suppressing a God-given, innate initiative to think, design, and build to improve life for the general good, but instead to relax until it was necessary to continue marauding and looting, leaving no legacy but a video like this that exposes that shameful legacy. No, Perowne couldn't have imagined the dots we are now forced to connect and confront as we glean our takeaway from having observed this repeated pattern of social behavior. That takeaway is now very clear. Feckless looters, beware. If society wishes to put an abrupt end to the scourge of looting that stems from fecklessness, a very grand sense of self-aggrandizement that leads to devastation, degradation, decadence, and societal decay, we must be sure, as Virgil said when dealing with this problem, that we bring the haughty, low,